02:14 in the morning, February 11th, 2026. Dyagilevo Air Base, Ryazan Oblast, Russia. 520 kilometers from the nearest patch of ground Ukraine controls. Lieutenant Pavel Rybak is finishing cold tea in the base control tower when the horizon flashes orange. Then it flashes again, in a rhythm that isn't lightning and isn't supposed to be possible this far from the front. He's 26, 6 years into a career he chose because his father flew transport planes out of the same base in the 90s. And until tonight, the most eventful thing on his shift log was a fuel truck that failed a pressure check. He will tell investigators later that he counted 6 explosions before the radio started screaming. By sunrise, satellite photographs will show 2 blackened craters where a neat row of Il-78 Midas refueling tankers used to sit on the open apron. Aviation kerosene doesn't burn out fast. Some of those fires are still going at noon. This is the story of how a swarm of Ukrainian drones crossed the deepest stretch of Russian airspace they had ever flown, to hit the one aircraft nobody in Moscow had bothered to protect. Not a bomber, not a fighter, a flying fuel truck. And without it, Russia's entire strategic bomber fleet doesn't fly at all. 2 questions are going to follow this raid for months. How did 17 Ukrainian drones cross an air defense belt built specifically to stop this? And why, after 3 years of war, did Russia leave its most irreplaceable aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip with no shelter at all? Stick around, because the answer to the second question is almost more embarrassing than the first. To understand why this raid mattered, you have to understand what an Il-78 actually does. Because most people watching a Tu-95 bomber take off on the news have no idea it can't reach its target without one. The Il-78 Midas is a flying gas station. Built on the airframe of an Il-76 cargo plane, it carries up to 85,000 kilograms of jet fuel and 3 refueling pods that let it top off 2 aircraft at once, mid-flight, at speeds over 500 kilometers an hour. Without it, a Tu-95 MS Bear bomber launching a KH-101 cruise missile strike has to fly the entire mission on internal fuel alone. That cuts its combat radius by roughly a third. It also means the bomber has to fly closer to Ukrainian air defenses to get its missiles in range. Russia doesn't have very many of these aircraft. Estimates from open-source trackers put the operational Il-78 fleet at 14 airframes before this raid, spread thin across 2 refueling regiments that were already juggling maintenance schedules older than some of the pilots flying them. Some were built in the 1980s at the Tashkent aircraft plant, a factory that stopped producing them decades ago, in a country, Uzbekistan, that Russia can no longer simply order more from. You cannot buy a new one. You cannot build one quickly. Every Il-78 lost is gone for good. That is the aircraft Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate, known by its acronym HER, decided to go after in the winter of 2026. The operation didn't have a poetic code name. Internally, planners called it Sukhi Bak, dry tank. It's the kind of name that tells you exactly what the target list looked like before a single drone left the ground. Planning began in October 2025, according to 2 officers familiar with the mission who spoke to journalists on condition their names not be used. The unit responsible answers to HER Director Kyrilo Budanov, and the strike package itself was assembled from a squadron that had, by then, already hit targets deep inside Russia at Engels and at Morozovsk. The man running the drone wing that night went by the call sign Falcon. He was 31 years old. Before the war, he flew commercial cargo routes out of Borispil. Now he flies missions, where the aircraft he's piloting is smaller than a kitchen table and worth less than a used car, and the target is worth more than the annual budget of a mid-sized city. Falcon's weapon of choice for this raid, the AQ-400 Scythe, a Ukrainian-built long-range strike drone with a stated range past 700 kilometers and a payload bay that, on this mission, carried a 35-kilogram thermobaric warhead. 14 of them were assigned to the main strike package. 3 slower Liu-T drones, cheaper and built partly from off-the-shelf parts, were tasked with a separate job entirely. That separate job is the reason this raid worked at all, and we'll get to exactly what it was. First, the obstacle nobody in Kyiv could plan around. A cold front rolled in off the Sea of Azov 4 days before the planned launch window, dragging freezing rain and crosswinds across the staging airfield in Sumy Oblast. 2 of the 14 Scythe drones scheduled for the mission needed their control surfaces de-iced by hand, in the open, at night, because the hangar heaters weren't rated for the volume of airframes waiting to go out. Falcon's team lost 36 hours to weather alone. In a war where every day of delay is a day Russian intelligence might notice unusual drone traffic on satellite passes, 36 hours is not nothing. They pushed the launch back once, then the skies cleared on the night of February 10th, and Falcon made the call to go. Here's what's genuinely strange about the target they were flying at. Dyagilevo isn't some obscure backwater strip. It's one of the oldest strategic aviation bases in the Russian Air Force, home since the Soviet era to heavy bombers and the tankers that support them. It sits inside a ring of air defense that includes an S-400 battalion, mobile Pantsir S-1 short-range systems, and at least one Buk M3 battery rotated in from a reserve unit after prior Ukrainian strikes elsewhere in Russia. On paper, that's a lethal amount of coverage for anything flying low and slow. I spent a while going through open-source flight tracking data and satellite passes from the weeks before the raid, and one detail kept nagging at me. The tankers weren't dispersed. 6 Il-78s sat clustered on a single stretch of open apron, wingtip to wingtip, the way you'd park cars in an overflow lot rather than the way you'd protect a weapon system that costs more than most Air Force's entire annual budget. There were no hardened aircraft shelters over any of them, not one. Put yourself in the shoes of whoever was responsible for dispersal orders at that base. You know Ukrainian drones have hit airfields 500 kilometers from the border before. You know your own aircraft are sitting in the open, and you still don't move them, because building revetments costs money. Nobody wants to spend on a base most planners assumed was simply too far away to matter. That assumption is the entire reason this story exists. 3 months before the raid, a source inside Ukraine's HER network began feeding back photographs of the Dyagilevo apron, taken by a local contact whose identity has never been made public. The imagery showed exactly how the tankers were parked, when ground crews rotated shifts, and which stretch of perimeter fence had the weakest lighting after 1 a.m. Then, 11 days before the strike, that contact went silent. No message for 48 hours. Then 72. Planners had to decide whether to proceed on stale intelligence or delay a mission that had already slipped once because of weather. They chose to trust the last confirmed layout and adjust the flight plan around the possibility that the base had changed its routine in the meantime. The contact resurfaced 2 days before launch. A family emergency, nothing related to the operation. But for nearly 3 days, an entire strike package was flying blind on information that might already have been outdated, and nobody in Kyiv knew it until it was almost too late to matter. The route Falcon's team chose ran northeast out of Sumy Oblast, threading a corridor between known radar coverage zones near Voronezh and Lipetsk before turning north toward Ryazan. Total distance to target, 520 kilometers, almost all of it over Russian territory, almost all of it below the altitude where most fixed radar installations get reliable returns on something the size of a Scythe drone. Low and slow isn't glamorous. It's also very hard to see. The first wave of Scythe drones crosses into Ryazan Oblast airspace at roughly 0140, according to the reconstructed timeline Shua later shared with two Western outlets. 12 minutes later, at 01:52, ground-based air defense near the town of Skopin picks up an unidentified low-altitude contact and scrambles a Pantsir crew to track it. That's when the three Lyuty drones earn their pay. Falcon's team had built the mission with a deliberate decoy leg. The three Lyuty drones, slower and cheaper, were routed to fly a loud, obvious profile toward a radar station well east of the actual tanker apron, popping up briefly at altitudes where they'd be easy to detect. Three Lyuty drones peel off toward the radar array at 01:58, drawing the Skopin Pantsir crew's attention west, away from the main strike package, still creeping north at treetop height. It worked, for about 11 minutes, at least. One of the three Lyuty drones is shot down near Skopin at 02:04. Russian state media will later claim all three were destroyed. Satellite debris analysis conducted afterward suggests otherwise. But that particular argument between Kyiv and Moscow over exact kill counts is one you'll see repeated after almost every strike like this one. And it rarely gets resolved cleanly either way. What matters is that the diversion bought the main strike package the minutes it needed. At 02:09, the 14 Scythe drones crossed the final 10 kilometers to Dyagilevo. This is the part of the mission with zero margin for error. If even one radar operator on base glances at the wrong screen at the wrong second, the whole strike collapses into a scramble of Pantsir fire, and the tankers survive the night untouched. Nobody glances at the wrong screen. At 02:14, the first Scythe drone reaches the apron and dives. Warheads punch through the thin aluminum skin of the lead Il-78's fuselage just aft of the wing root, where the fuel lines run. The explosion that follows isn't the drone's 35 kilograms of thermobaric payload doing the real damage. It's the 85,000 kilograms of jet fuel already sitting inside the aircraft's own tanks. 6 explosions follow in under 90 seconds. Lieutenant Rybak's tea goes cold in his hand. By 02:31, 3 of the 6 Il-78 tankers on the apron are burning uncontrollably. A fourth has taken shrapnel damage across its refueling pods, which will turn out to be almost as costly as an outright loss, because a tanker that can't refuel anything is a very expensive fuel truck. Base firefighting crews reach the scene within minutes, according to the reconstructed timeline. But aviation kerosene fires don't respond to standard foam trucks the way a structure fire does. The fuel keeps feeding itself. Among the first responders is a 20-year-old conscript named Ilya, 3 months into his mandatory service, whose only firefighting training before that night was a 2-day course on structure fires that never once mentioned burning jet fuel. He'll suffer minor burns to his forearms, pulling a hose line closer to the second tanker before his sergeant orders the crew back to a safe distance and lets the fire simply run its course. Some sections of the apron are still burning at 05:40, more than 3 hours after the first impact, sending a column of black smoke visible on commercial satellite imagery taken later that morning. Here's the take that'll probably annoy some viewers of this channel. Russia's air defense investment around Dyagilevo wasn't a failure of technology. The S-400, the Pantsir, the Buck battery, all of that hardware worked exactly as designed against exactly the threat it was designed for. The failure was assuming a base 520 kilometers from the front line would never need to worry about a threat flying below 1,000 feet at 200 kilometers an hour. That assumption, not any missing radar, is what actually cost Russia its tankers. Dawn breaks gray over a scorched apron by the time Base Command finishes its initial headcount. 2 Il-78M airframes are total losses, burned down to their landing gear and spars. A third is damaged badly enough that engineers on site estimate months of repair, if parts can even be sourced from a factory that no longer exists in the country that built it. A fourth carries shrapnel damage to a refueling pod that will need replacing. 2 tankers survived the night without a scratch, saved only by the width of the gap between parking rows. By mid-morning, a small team from the regional FSB directorate arrives to comb the perimeter fence line for drone wreckage, the same stretch of weak lighting the HUR contact had flagged months earlier. They recover fragments of at least 2 airframes, including a servo motor with a partial serial number and a length of carbon fiber wing spar scorched almost beyond recognition. Investigators photograph everything, bag it, and drive it 3 hours to a lab in Moscow, hoping the components will tell them something about where the drones were built and how they got so close without anyone calling it in. The report that comes back weeks later reportedly confirms what analysts already suspected: off-the-shelf components routed through third countries, which is to say, it tells them almost nothing they can act on. What do you think? Is a military failure this basic? 6 tankers parked in the open with no shelters on the officers who set that dispersal policy? Or is it simply what happens to any air force fighting a 3-year war against an enemy that keeps getting better drones? Sit with that for a second before you answer in the comments, because the honest answer probably isn't as clean as either side wants it to be. The strategic math here is blunt. Before the raid, open-source trackers counted roughly 14 operational Il-78 tankers left in Russian service. After it, that number drops into single digits of aircraft immediately mission-capable, with the rest scattered across repair queues or grounded for parts. The arithmetic behind the raid is simple. You don't need to destroy a single Tu-95 bomber to ground a bomber fleet. You just need to take away its gas station. Within the first week after the strike, satellite imagery analyzed by open-source researchers showed a noticeable drop in long-range Tu-95 MS sorties launched from Engels and Olenia, the 2 bases most dependent on Dyagilevo-based tankers for extended patrols. Fewer sorties means fewer cruise missile salvos reaching Ukrainian cities. It's a quieter kind of victory than a shot-down bomber, and it almost never makes the front page. But ask any Ukrainian air defense planner which one they'd rather have. There's a detail in the aftermath reporting that stuck with me more than anything else. Colonel Andrei Voronin, the base's ranking aviation officer, reportedly submitted a request for hardened aircraft shelters at Dyagilevo 18 months before this raid. That request sat in a procurement queue behind bigger-ticket items: air defense radars for bases closer to the front, replacement engines for the bomber fleet itself, and was never funded. You'd think a base holding some of Russia's most irreplaceable aircraft would have jumped that queue. It didn't. Russian state media, in its coverage the following day, described the incident as a fire at a technical facility, with no casualties and no significant damage. Independent satellite analysts published side-by-side before and after imagery within 48 hours showing otherwise. That gap between the official version and the imagery anyone with an internet connection could check is becoming a familiar shape in this war. As for Lieutenant Rybak, the duty officer who counted 6 explosions from the control tower, his account only became public because it was included in a leaked internal incident report reviewed by journalists at an independent Russian outlet operating from outside the country. He wasn't disciplined for the incident. There wasn't much he could have done differently from where he was standing, but 2 more senior officers connected to the base's dispersal policy were reportedly reassigned within a month, in what Russian defense bloggers described, without much subtlety, as a quiet way of assigning blame without admitting the scale of the loss in public. Ever wonder what it actually costs a country to lose an aircraft it can't rebuild? This is roughly what it looks like. Not a headline, not a press conference, just a procurement office somewhere in Moscow, quietly recalculating how many bomber sorties are still realistically possible next quarter, and coming up with a smaller number than it had the week before. We won't pretend every detail of this raid has been independently verified beyond dispute. Some of the operational specifics, the exact radio traffic, the precise sequence Falcon's team used to route around the Skopin radar gap, come from accounts that Ukrainian officials have not fully declassified. What the satellite imagery does confirm, without argument from either side, is the outcome. 2 tankers destroyed, 2 more damaged. A fleet that was already thin, stretched even thinner. Whether this single raid changes the overall trajectory of the air war is a different question, and a harder one. Russia still has bombers. It still has missiles. What it has less of, after February 11th, is the ability to keep those bombers flying long missions without draining fuel reserves faster than tankers can replace them. That's not a knockout blow. It's closer to cutting one artery in a body that has several. Whether that matters in 6 months or a year probably depends on whether Ukraine can keep finding gaps, like the one Falcon's team found over Skopin. We didn't have room in this one to get into what happened to the second informant network Ha maintains near Ryazan, the one that fed intelligence for a follow-up strike 3 weeks later. That's a story with its own obstacles, its own close call, and its own ending we haven't seen anyone else cover yet. Comment more below if you want us to go there next, because we're genuinely not sure whether to make that the next episode or save it. If this is the kind of story you want more of, deep dives into the strikes that don't make the evening news but quietly reshape what an Air Force can and can't do, subscribe and tell us in the comments which base you think Ukraine goes after next. Because somewhere tonight, another duty officer at another Russian base is finishing his tea, and he has no idea yet whether he's about to become the next Lieutenant Rybak.